Boston, Massachusetts, a city of innovation, resilience, and culture. From cobblestone streets that whisper revolutionary tales to the energy of Fenway Park and the legacy of Harvard Square, Boston is more than just a place. It's a symbol of endless possibilities. Boston is a city of many firsts. First subway in the United States, the first public school, the first public park, and the first public library. Boston is also known for its engineering marvels and infrastructure projects. Boston's rich history is woven into its streets, its people, and its culture. That's the Boston you know. But beneath this vibrant exterior lies another story. One of resilience, transformation, and unfortunately, a tremendous amount of loss. Because Americans prior to redlining and urban renewal lived in ethnic groups, in village-like communities, each group formed a cultural economic hub that developed culturally based economies. Ironically, this cultural unity made the groups easier to target and erase. The most prominent cultural hubs in Boston today are Chinatown or Little Italy in the North End. A cultural hub is a community where ethnic groups pass down knowledge and traditions, transforming them into cultural products and services. Information like recipes become iconic dishes in local restaurants, and skills learned from older generations evolve into entertainment at jazz clubs. These hubs represent the powerful intersection of culture and infrastructure, where heritage fuels financial vitality, where culture and economics are one. Although there are many emerging cultural hubs like Eggleston Square is Dominican, parts of Dorchester are Vietnamese, and Mattapan is Little Haiti, we have to ask the question, what about the cultural legacy of African Americans in Roxbury, the Little Syria community in the South End, the African American community in Cambridge, called Riverside or the Coast, the historic multicultural West End, New York streets, Chinatown, or even Jewish Dorchester? What happened to these cultural hubs? As great as Boston is, whenever you uncover the history and see what's missing, you can't help but wonder how much greater Boston could have really been. Streets once alive with cultural economic activity now echo with the silence of displacement or gleam with the coldness of new developments. This is the story of Boston we rarely see. A story of urban renewal, redlining, and the displacement of vibrant cultural hubs. Neighborhoods that were once thriving centers of life and culture were forever altered, sacrificed in the name of so-called progress. What happens when infrastructure meant to foster progress becomes a weapon of exclusion? What do zoning laws, highway routes, and transit decisions reveal about whose lives were deemed expendable and whose futures were prioritized? How often do modern decisions repeat, reinforce, or even expand upon the systemic discrimination embedded in our city's foundations? Literally. Perhaps the real question is, can we truly speak of these injustices in the past tense when their impact remains so deeply rooted in the present? Boston in the early 20th century was shaped by migration. Waves of European immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Italians and Jews escaping fascism, and others seeking just a better life for their families, transformed many neighborhoods. At the same time, African American refugees fled lynchings and the systemic oppression of Jim Crow laws in the segregated South, moving north in what we call the Great Escape, some call the Great Migration. As the cities evolved, so did its social and economic landscape. Prominent Brahmin families, you may know some of these names in Boston, like the Adams family, Coolidge. They all retreated from downtown, creating enclaves like the Back Bay. This filled-in swamp wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a deliberate act of social planning designed to preserve hierarchies and distance from immigrant-dominated neighborhoods. This trend of shaping neighborhoods to reflect societal hierarchies persisted until the 20th century, culminating in the issuance of the Boston Redline Map on February 1st, 1938, a tool that institutionalized systemic exclusion and reshaped the city forever. The map's color codes were based on detailed discriminatory surveys. Words like infiltration revealed the intent to exclude. Green, blue, yellow, and red affected the hierarchy of desirability. Red, hazardous. Predominantly African American and other marginalized working class groups. These areas were labeled as economic liabilities, linking skin color directly to property values. Yellow, declining. Working class European immigrant communities. These communities had resources and were better educated, so more nuanced approaches were utilized. And they were depopulated using a series of tactics like block busting and the removal of critical access routes like the trolleys. Blue, desirable. Middle and upper class neighborhoods aligned with Boston's elite. Green, the best. Reserved for Boston's Brahmin upper class, these areas epitomized privilege and received heavy investment. They maintained their proximity to Boston's opportunities while staying exclusively separate cities. But this wasn't just about Boston. Similar maps were issued nationwide. The Redline map didn't just mark areas for neglect. It predicted their decline. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act leveraged redlining maps to plan highways and urban renewal projects that destroy cultural hubs and displace thousands. These maps laid the groundwork for decisions about development, displacement, and investment that would shape America forever. Every red dot on this map represents thousands of people displaced and communities of culture leveled to the ground. 64 billion, 300 million federal dollars spent, 1 million people, about 300,000 families evicted from their homes, more than 50% of the dislocations being African American families. About 440,000 buildings demolished, with the program ending in 1974 under President Nixon. Other national programs influenced by the Redline map include the 1944 GI Bill, offering returning soldiers pathways to ownership, but African Americans and other minorities were systematically excluded. In 1961, the introduction of zip codes institutionalized the divisions first codified in the Redline map. The North End, designated D5 on the Redline map, in the prior century was home to what is considered to be one of the first communities of free African Americans in the United States. Known as the New Guinea Settlement, it was a hub for abolitionist movements and a starting point for resilience. The names like Hall, Barbados, Augustus, Ritchie, and Coley are among the few markers left in the African American section of Copp's Hills Cemetery in the North End, where Boston's free black community, the New Guinea Settlement, once thrived. Phyllis Wheatley, the first black woman to publish a book in America, is reportedly buried here, though no marker commemorates her or her husband. But by mid-19th century, African Americans were displaced from the North End as redevelopment, rising rents, and influx of Irish immigrants forced them to move to the West End.
Today, or even back then, it was forgotten. And these guys carried on their history, and they were amazing people. They were Jewish, Italian, black, Irish, Polish. It was like a melting pot.
In the West End, designated D6 in the Redline map, African Americans joined Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European immigrants, creating a multicultural neighborhood often described as Little United Nations. It is important to note that the West End and the North End at this point were once one, indicated by the Redline map description, similar in all respects. 4 years before the Redline map was issued, Sumner Tunnel was built in 1934. New England's first vehicular travel tunnel linked North End to East Boston. Despite displacing the mostly European immigrant population, the project was hugely beneficial to the commerce in both communities. It was also foreshadowing the mass displacement due to infrastructure to come. In the West End, the African Meeting House served as a key venue for abolitionist gatherings. Frederick Douglass delivered powerful speeches there, rallying support for abolition of slavery and advocating for equality. The collaboration between African Americans and Boston's Brahmin elite in the West End contributed significantly to the fight against slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act, and laid the foundation of abolition and integration. Despite the many challenges, African Americans in the West End achieved remarkable milestones. Integrated education before the Civil War fostered leaders like Boston's first black lawyer, the first black female doctor, and Robert Roberts.
Some of the first very wealthy people that come out of the black community in the West End are like a butler who writes this really, like the top-selling book on how to be a butler, and dies with an estate of something like, it's like $40,000, the equivalent of many millions of dollars today.
But this harmony was short-lived. The construction of the elevated highway Central Artery displaced 20,000 residents, severing ties between the North and the West End communities and erasing a vibrant cultural hub. From 1991 to 2007, the Central Artery was buried underground with I-90 tunnels to Logan Airport and East Boston in what is now known as the Big Dig, creating ultimately the Rose Kennedy Greenway that we enjoy today. Redline, as hazardous in 1938, along with the North End, the West End was deliberately neglected and ultimately destroyed under the guise of urban renewal a generation later.
So redlining as a practice is based on the idea that different races living in close proximity reduces the property values. That is what underlines basically everything going forward.
The designation of the West End and the North End as hazardous on the Redline map set the stage for decades of disinvestment and neglect, leading to the erasure of these communities.
Hoyt and Richard T. Ely created the National Association of Real Estate Boards, so very influential even to this day organization. And they imbued the real estate boards with this idea that, again, racial proximity lowers property values. It was sort of a colloquial racist idea that they formalized into a real estate practice. And then these two, Hoyt and Ely, go on to directly write the language that goes into the redlining legislation, or the HOLC. They don't call it redlining legislation, but the creation of the HOLC.
Roxbury's significance lies in Boston's expansion, particularly the landfilling of the Back Bay and South Bay around the Boston Neck. This narrow land bridge, that would be impassable during high tides, was once Boston's only gateway to mainland Massachusetts. As Boston grew, the Emerald Necklace, designed by architect Frederick Olmsted, encircled the Boston Neck, while the Boston Wishbone forms the infrastructural skeleton beneath it. Stretching down from Washington Street to Nubian Square, the Boston Wishbone takes us to the heart of the city, and then splits west to Forest Hills and east to Mattapan, serving as an opportunity corridor from downtown through Nubian Square to the southern neighborhoods in Boston. The large red area marked labeled hazardous on the Redline map is where Lower Roxbury and South End residents built enduring multicultural hubs and organizations.
Well, I went to dancing school. I took tap, toe, and in ballet.
Is that, do you remember being in recitals like that?
Yes.
They were pretty big affairs. They were pretty big deals.
Yes.
You know, maybe 100 people would come, maybe more.
And I remember burn, fire, burn, flicker, 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 flame.
It had 3 classifications in this area. D7, Syrian and Chinese communities lived. D8 predominantly Irish, with about 5% African Americans. D9, a multicultural mix of Italian, Irish, Jewish, and of course, 25% African Americans.
So starting in like the 50s and 60s, as white flight is taking place and quote unquote inner cities are becoming more and more non-white because of that loss of white population, almost universal, this happens in basically every city. As white flight is taking place, sort of classic elites of the city are not thrilled that people are leaving, specifically white people. So urban renewal and highway construction becomes a means to remove physically undesirable populations by demolishing the neighborhood, by saying it's a slum, and then replacing that with facilities that are designed to attract people back from the suburbs.
In the preliminary relocation survey from May 4th, 1965, by the Right-of-Way Bureau to Commissioner Sargent, the findings were clear. Despite the warnings about critical housing shortage and social consequences of displacing hundreds of low-income families, the demolition plans for the Inner Belt Highway project moved forward. Lower Roxbury's multicultural community flourished until the proposed highways threatened to dismantle these vibrant areas. Had I-95 been built, its route would have followed the commuter rail through Reedville, up Hyde Park Avenue, with an off-ramp at West Street. It would have continued to Forest Hills, merged with today's Orange Line, passed through Jamaica Plain, intersected with the canceled Inner Loop in Roxbury, and then joined the Mass Pike, I-90, near Back Bay. Demolitions had already begun from Roxbury to Hyde Park. The anti-highway movement, while not saving every community, spared thousands from displacement and preserved vital green spaces in Boston. Without grassroots resistance, Hyde Park would have become a dense urban landscape, much like the Ink Block area in Old Chinatown. Instead, the community's character and natural environment were preserved.
What's important to remember in talking about the story of the anti-highway fight is that much of the conversation was around the clearance in the West End. And so before the highway fight really begins in the 1960s, people remembered in a very visceral and intense way the destruction of the West End. And in many ways, that story was a cautionary tale for folks. That they remembered that thousands of families had been removed from a neighborhood that was home, a multiracial neighborhood, a multi-ethnic neighborhood, certainly known as an Italian neighborhood of the West End, but there were Black families there were Jewish families there, Irish families there that really called that home. And to understand that there was a really vibrant working class community that was peaceful and well integrated in the heart of downtown is a story. And so as people who are in other neighborhoods watch the destruction and clearance of that neighborhood, it sent a message. And when folks started to hear about this other project that was happening to bring I-95 into the city, people really remembered what had happened before. But really the memory of the West End and people being haunted by that was really important for activating people to say, we're not going to let that happen to us. And even though people didn't think it was possible to stop a road, they really committed to saying no.
The anti-highway movement, driven by community activism, successfully halted the construction in 1972. But for many, the victory came way too late. The relocation of the Orange Line from Dudley to Roxbury Crossing marks a turning point. This shift removed critical infrastructure from the eastern arm of the Boston Wishbone, leaving Eggleston Square and nearby areas economically isolated. Replacing trains with buses discouraged tourism, impacting the local economy and ultimately displacing thousands of Jewish residents. Redlining depressed property values, allowing developers to buy homes cheaply. Residents were pressured to sell at seemingly great prices, but with the inner loop slated to cut through the neighborhood, who would risk buying a home destined for demolition?
It's the private banks that the government is giving money to to bail out people. They're not giving it directly to people. The same thing happened in 2008 with the housing
Right.
crisis. They're giving it to the banks to bail out the people that they want to bail out. And that's racial. It's explicitly racialized. They will do it in the green areas and the blue areas, to some extent the yellow, but not in the red.
Right.
And that is because of the population of the people that live there.
And how they just stole our culture from us, our food from us, our homes from us, et cetera, et cetera. So it's so complicated, the hurdles that my people have overcome.
The house being taken from Oakland Avenue by eminent domain, that was when I first ventured out into my own and had my first apartment down on Mass Avenue.
The reason why we moved across the street from our original location is that our building was targeted for eminent domain by the city of Boston. It was a large amount of gentrification happening in this area. If you know anything about the South End, the South End is a historical area. Has the largest collection of brownstones in the United States. And so it's been designated as a historical area. And in the 70s, and I'm in the height of the gentrification for the area, it was a large demographic shift.
Many that sold their homes realized they could no longer afford to live in the communities they grew up in for generations. Like Roxbury, Riverside was marked for disinvestment. Leaders like Sandra Graham fought tirelessly for affordable housing and community preservation in the face of gentrification. Her legendary protests at Harvard graduation ceremony highlighted the ongoing struggle against powerful institutions like MIT and Harvard acquiring homes at bargain prices through third parties.
They were talking black people into selling their houses. They were trying to buy out their houses. And a lot of those people sold their houses for like 50, 60, 70 grand. Nothing. Beautiful black homes.
The oil on the fire was the fact that Harvard, they might have been awesome people up front. They were sneaking and buying up our land and properties under other names, IDBA and everything.
If left intact, these communities would now represent over a century of development and stability. But is it a mere coincidence that these cultural economic centers just happen to lie along routes of canceled highways? Could this systemic erasure of cultural economic hubs be a root cause of today's racial wealth gap? To expect that these communities simply pick themselves up by their bootstraps wherever they find themselves without addressing the effect of repeated displacement is, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, a cruel jest. In the seminal document, White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, Advancing Racial Equity Through Highway Reconstruction, the systemic use of infrastructure to enforce and extend segregation is laid bare.
There is a good Ta-Nehisi Coates quote about this, basically saying that white flight is not a mystery. It was the policy of the federal and state government that said that white people should enjoy easy access from the suburbs to the jobs in the central city without ever having to interact with non-white people, specifically black people. The highways, in addition to punching through to connect the new suburbs to the downtown, they also divide between neighborhoods. They, just like I said, a train track used to be a means to separate white and black areas and therefore uphold the property values. But then when the highways come along, that becomes a supercharged mean. That becomes an even bigger division.
Federal and state officials marketed this destruction as urban renewal, masking slum clearance that benefited white suburbanites while displacing low-income and black urban residents. The 1968 assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sparked protests nationwide in what is known as Holy Week Uprising. At the end of the 7 days, the Fair Housing Act, the last of the civil rights acts attributed to the slain leader, passed on April 11, 1968, ending legal segregation and redlining in the United States. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. communities erased based on race, concrete foundations on neighborhoods were already in place. A common historical oversight is the effect urban renewal had on the civil rights movement. Legislation that gave African Americans protections against racism, rights to vote, housing protections, were undermined by urban renewal demolitions because the communities who gave blood, sweat, and tears for centuries for equality were simply no longer in place to vote as African American districts laid in ruin, never forever to enjoy the newly found freedoms and make their collective voices heard. In Grove Hall, tensions erupted. Boston's mayor attempted to ease unrest, yet the damage had already been done. By then, North Dorchester, which was coded for African American in redlining maps, faced rapid decline. In response to the Fair Housing Act, the Boston Bank's Urban Renewal Group, BBURG, created and marketed areas in Dorchester to African Americans. It was well known that the golden age for African Americans and Jewish American relations was kind of based on common ground and shared struggles. From the Civil Rights Movement to the Freedom Riders to the Freedom Summer murders of 1964, where African American and Jewish students Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered by the KKK. African Americans had their Jewish allies, many of whom offered jobs and dignity to African Americans when other white ethnic groups in Boston did not. Banks, unable to profit from mortgages in already Jewish-owned areas, resorted to infrastructural neglect and blockbusting tactics. These deliberate strategies spurred white flight while simultaneously trapping African American homeowners who had recently moved to Dorchester in a cycle of systemic entrapment.
So my mom was not really aware of all the racial tension and things like that happening in the city. She wasn't familiar. My mom had a very heavy accent, but she learned English. She was able to secure a job at Boston Edison, retired from there. Interestingly though, her siblings and her moved into a home together, somewhere also in Dorchester. But when she went to go look for homes, she went and got a real estate agent, was looking for a home. They always took her to the projects. So eventually she had to say, you know what, I'm not interested in this. This is not where I'm gonna raise my family. So finally, she was able to go ahead and look at properties. And she wasn't aware of what redlining was. So she tells me stories where she went to a couple of homes, she'd call, and my mom, even though she was a Haitian immigrant, she had a beautiful British kind of accent. My grandmother was from St. Thomas, so my mom also had a bit of an English accent going. She would call, and they'd say, come on in. She would go, take a look at the home, and they were like, oh, sorry, not available. Oh, sorry, we didn't realize, no, you can't come in. It's already sold, it's already under agreement. And she was taken aback by that.
Designated C10, Western Dorchester, or C11, now Mattapan on the Redline map, all of this was yellow. Yellow lining is a subtler form of discrimination when compared to redlining, and it targeted newly arriving Jewish, Italian, and European immigrants deemed not white enough. Yet yellow lining works differently as populations that they targeted were usually more united, wealthy, and educated.
Well, a group called the Mattapan Organization, which was a civic group, tried to fight this. They had a committee. They met with all the realtors who were blockbusting, but the realtors basically said, we're not doing anything illegal. They went to the Jewish Community Relations Council and Combined Jewish Philanthropy and asked them to support a court suit against the banks for the way that they were restricting mortgages to one area, and they wouldn't help them. It was a class thing because there were working class Jews in the area versus middle class and upper middle class Jews in the community leadership of the Jewish community, and then they also went to the mayor and city council, and they didn't help them too. So but there was organizing. It was attempted, but it was not successful, and they didn't get support from the Jewish community leaders as well as from the mayor and the city council. City council passed an ordinance against blockbusting, but the fine was $25.
For decades, historic Jewish Dorchester flourished. Synagogues, schools, businesses symbolized pride and resilience. But realtors, racial covenants, and infrastructure removal, like the dismantling of the trolley lines, crippled the cultural economic engine. When the trolleys vanished, so did the cultural economic heartbeat of these neighborhoods. Today, the Neponset River starkly divides affluence from working class communities. Unlike many other redlining map borders, this divide is marked by a naturally occurring barrier, the Neponset. In just a 60-second walk, one can cross from the blue and green coated affluent Milton into Mattapan, once labeled yellow, now effectively redlined. This area has become subject to redline sprawl, where characteristics of redline communities spread into neighboring working-class multicultural areas. A common narrative is that transportation is uniform, but they're not. They cater to different populations by services, location, and comforts, allowing us to self-segregate. Promised transit improvements such as the Silver Line train never materialized. Instead, a bus was provided as a substitute. Let's think of who rides these transportation routes. Commuter rails fail to serve the working class due to long intervals and high costs, so they predominantly cater for middle and upper class suburbanites. Meanwhile, tourism transportation, like the duck boats, cater to a different demographic altogether. With no tourist destinations in these historic neighborhoods, they do not receive the tourism revenue that much of the other parts of the city enjoy. Infrastructure segregates Boston as much as geography, reinforcing the economic and social divides across the city. Without investment in local economies, transit serves only to export labor while importing gentrification. The heart of these communities, a self-sustaining economy, remains the missing piece. While we focused on displacement of African Americans, other communities were also affected and erased. Let's go back to D7 in the South End. This was the multicultural New York Streets district where legendary Boston civil rights leader Mel King grew up. Here, Little Syria and Chinatown form a vital Asian connection where communities worked, lived, and grew together.
The early Syria town or Little Syria community overlapped with Chinatown. And by all accounts, this was a very warm and friendly relationship between the two immigrant communities. And if you think about it, Syria is in West Asia, China is in East Asia. So this is effectively an Asian community, and the immigrants at that time, up until around 1915, were all affected by the same immigration laws that prevented them from applying for citizenship. I myself am the product of a Lebanese-American father and a Greek-American mother.
Over time, infrastructural changes and city neglect led many in the Syrian community to relocate to neighborhoods like West Roxbury and Norwood, which remains a reminder as a cost of urban renewal and the resilience of displaced communities. In white men's roads through black men's homes, urban planner Robert Moses exemplifies how infrastructure was weaponized to entrench segregation. Low-clearance bridges on New York's Southern State Parkway intentionally blocked buses, ensuring Black and Puerto Rican residents couldn't access public beaches. As Moses himself said, legislation can always be changed, but it's hard to tear down a bridge once it's up. And yes, he's right. In Boston, mass displacement of African American communities happens just about every 60 years, with white communities replacing them. In the mid-1800s, African American New Guinea community was displaced from the North End, now Little Italy, and resettled in the West End. In the early 1900s, thriving African American neighborhoods in the West End, now the affluent Beacon Hill, were displaced, forcing moves to the South End and Lower Roxbury. In the mid-1900s, African American communities were displaced and destroyed by redlining urban renewal in the Lower Roxbury and the Coast community in Cambridge. It's been 60 years since the urban renewal projects of the 1960s, with city rezoning and new infrastructure investments underway. History seems poised to repeat itself. Increasing building heights and investment in transit-rich neighborhoods of Boston will ultimately drive property values up, leading to the displacement of communities of culture in the Beeburg area and other redline communities. It doesn't matter if the building codes have changed since the 1600s. the laws of the old still influence our lives today. Redlining and urban renewal are not merely relics of the past that echo today. They remain current issues. Without infrastructural and culturally equitable urban development, these problems persist and continue to shape our present and foreseeable future. According to a 2013 Institute for Policy Studies report called The Ever-Growing Gap, it says racial wealth gap for African Americans would take about 238 years to fix. But how can we grow if an African American community has to start every 60 years or so? Closing the racial wealth gap starts with ensuring community-level stability for descendants of formerly enslaved African American communities. It also says that it will take 84 years for Latino communities to close the racial wealth gap. Why is there a difference? According to the 2015 Color of Wealth in Boston report, the racial wealth gap often cites Black people making $8 per family compared to $247,500 for white families. But we have to dig deeper. This report also reveals that there are cultural nuances that point away from solely racial determinants of wealth gaps. Not all Black people were subject to the level of racism experienced in the United States of America. Even among former enslaved Black people, U.S.-born Black households differ from Caribbean households. Nigerian Americans will make median household income of about $72,500, slightly below the white Americans, but higher than the overall U.S. average. African Americans currently are the only group in the history of humanity to not be able to point to a cultural homeland. Their cultural spaces, economics, and achievements in Boston have been erased by displacement. This isn't simply about discriminatory laws, spaces, and culture. It's also about life and death. According to the Health of Boston 2023 Executive Summary, in Redline Lower Roxbury, the life expectancy is 23 years less than in Back Bay. Redline sprawl affected Mattapan, and it currently has the lowest life expectancy in the city at 77.3 years. While just across the Neponset, 60 seconds walk, where residents live longer than most people in the whole state of Massachusetts, the life expectancy in Roxbury is 23 years less than in Back Bay. With the vast majority of foreign-born population of Boston, they stand to live longer if they return to their home country rather than living in Roxbury. Even war-torn Syria has a longer life expectancy. But we also need to put this into spatial context to complete this narrative. Syria doesn't have the best universities and teaching hospitals known to mankind less than 3 miles away. The aftermath of mass displacement of communities of culture and repeated mistakes of the West End are being repeated today. Public apologies were made back in the 70s, but the cultural economic damage had already been done. That's why it's important to know your history, so we can know where we need to go. Zoning and development law codifies racist practices from laws into concrete forever, or at least until the current race-based design of Boston is altered for all. New laws that don't codify into infrastructure have little or no effect on closing the racial wealth gap. The legacy of the People Before Highways movement calls us to prioritize community voices in urban development. The Redline Narratives of the Lost Cultural Hubs of Boston serve as a beacon, advocating for equitable urban planning, which includes social engineering like displacement protections before civil engineering begins. Ensuring these lost communities of culture are never forgotten. The cultural wealth gap may have to take precedence over the racial wealth gap for us to be successful. Either way, none can be addressed without long-term cultural hub stability. Restorative repair is not just about cultural economics, it's about rebuilding self-reliant cultural hub system, fostering tourism amongst these communities, and ensuring that no community will never again have to start over